So, welcome back, bienvenue. Most of you probably think that I know exactly what it is that I'm going to talk about when I get up in the morning. Well, guess again. I have 1,000,001 ideas and somehow we still ended up here. Some of you know that I have a degree in Asian studies. So I have studied Japanese language and culture, and it's no surprise that I often watch Japanese cinema. I did a whole video on the culture of death and departures, and even if you don't go watch my video, you should definitely watch the award-winning film. But today, I found myself wanting to talk about Seven Samurai of all things. And while I might have a slightly more in-depth knowledge of culture and history of Japan, your average person watching a Japanese film probably notices a few things that make them go, huh, that's weird, but not actually know why. I could go into the entire film and pick apart every tiny piece, but I decided to pick out a few of the bigger parts that probably confuse a more Western audience. It's a 1954 black and white film directed by one of the most influential directors in the world, Akira Kurosawa. And if you're a fan of Japanese, well, anything, this is definitely a name you should know. Seven Samurai is a film that delves into the period of samurai during the Sengoku period, or the Warring States period. And yes, that's as horrifying as it actually sounds. It is just a time of death and devastation. And what I love about this film is the attention to detail that Kurosawa paid to even the smallest piece. We're talking Japanese history and culture, both past and present. So here's a quick synopsis of this 3.5-hour movie. Seven Samurai follows the struggles of a small village of farmers plagued by seasonal raids and looting by rogue bandits. To save their dying way of life and home, an envoy of 3 farmers is sent to find samurai to help, offering rice in exchange for services of the samurai. At first, they're completely unsuccessful in wooing any samurai to their cause. But they do get lucky when it's finally answered by 6 samurai, plus an orphaned son of a farmer who's kind of a wannabe samurai. But rather than chase the bandits away from the village, which they probably could have done, the samurai decide to actually teach the farmers to defend themselves and then lead the farmers into battle against the bandits. Of course, once the village has won their battle, the samurai retreat from the village and leave it to the farmers. As I said, this film takes place during the 16th century of Japan, which was a time of bloodshed and disunity in Japan's evolution. I've said it before that samurai are a hereditary class. You are born a samurai. I think in my Departures video I talked about Japan's caste system. You know, you have your merchants at the bottom, and then you have your artisans, and your farmers, and your samurai. Of course, above that you have, nobility. But you don't really move in between your class. But this was a period of constant flux of masterless samurai in towns. Most likely because their daimyo died in one of the many battles that were going on. That obviously leaves a lot of samurai who want to hire out their abilities as very proficient warriors because, they gotta eat. That's fair, right? But because of this, we also see this initial wariness from the farmers when the samurai arrive at the village to help them. And that's definitely due to the fact that battles, death, and chaos of the time came at the hands of the warring samurai. Samurai could legitimately kill anybody they wanted. They didn't really have to have a reason. You offend them, they'll cut you down, or somebody passing through the streets decides they want to test the sharpness of their sword. Well, let's hope you're not the one in the way. Now, one of the things that you might notice in the film is this importance placed on rice, and that might leave you scratching your head a little bit. Because, it's just rice, right? Here's the thing. Rice was used as payment. It was basically currency and wealth, used for stipends for samurai, and that's how they collected taxes, and even was a form of investment and credit. If you had rice, then you had power. So rather than offer money to the samurai, which is something that poor farmers would definitely not have. They offered their most valuable asset, which is rice. I think at one point you see that the farmers are eating not very filling grains, I think maybe millet or something, in order to afford paying the samurai rice. Which I gotta say, if you're a toiling farmer out in the fields all day long, that is not really going to give you enough energy to keep going. These farmers weren't just fighting to survive, they were fighting to protect their livelihood. Losing their rice crop would be a death sentence for the entire village. Can you imagine what happens when the daimyo comes to collect their tax and they have no rice? Rice was so integral to the survival of the village, and that little detail of what the farmers would be eating is not something a lot of people would think about, let alone understand the meaning behind. But as I said, rice is power. But what I find super fun about this is the fact that this movie does have a love story, but it's not your typical love story. In fact, it's a love story that doesn't end the way that you would expect it to. It's not your traditional Hollywood happy ever after. In fact, the actual adaptation of Seven Samurai into an American film, which is The Magnificent Seven, has a completely different ending for the love story, one that forfeits that Hollywood ideal. This love story is the typical cliché forbidden love between a samurai, Katsuhiro, and a farmer's daughter, Shino. But remember what I said about movements between the classes not being easy or common? And in fact, later in the Tokugawa era, it was completely prohibited. So you have this character of Katsuhiro, who is a samurai, and eventually in life he would die a samurai. And you have the farmer's daughter, Shino, who would eventually go on to marry a farmer herself and have kids who will become farmers and farmers' wives. There's this specific scene that really drives this home for me. And it's when Shino's father beats her furiously and publicly. But it's Katsuhiro who feels shame because he knows he has done wrong here. The traditional Western ideal would be true love will conquer all. But Kurosawa pays very special attention to the detail here because at the end of the film, that's not what happens. When the surviving samurai leaves, so does Katsuhiro. And he leaves Shino in the fields with the other farmers because that's the way it is. And that's how it has to be. Kurosawa could have given them the classic happy ending, but I admire him for not lessening the significance of that moment. But let's look at one of the most fascinating aspects of the film, at least to me, and that's the allegorical cycle of Japan's defeat in the Great Pacific War and the occupation of Japan by the US. See, in the film we see the samurai enter the village, and they teach the farmers, and they help the farmers rebuild, and then when they're no longer needed, they leave. But for those who might not know their history, after the US defeated Japan, they occupied the country. They even wrote Japan a new constitution. They set up a democratic government. They wrote them a new constitution. They helped their economy get back on their feet. And when Japan was well on its way to recovery, the US just backed off. That's something a lot of people don't know. And surprisingly, Japan was very happy and eager to learn from the US. I don't think people really understand the level of suffering the people of Japan went through during the war. Though if you do want to find out a bit about that, there are some films you can watch. One I highly suggest is 24 Eyes. So as you can see, Seven Samurai is a classic film that doesn't follow that fast-paced action you'd find in a Hollywood film. That's part of its charm. It's Japanese. You can feel it in the story and the characters and those teeny tiny details that you didn't even know existed. Still, it's a film that appeals to a very large global audience, but at the same time manages to maintain this very uniquely Japanese perspective. This is definitely a film that inspired a whole new generation of filmmakers. Japanese culture and history is so completely unique because of how they evolve. And Seven Samurai is this snapshot into a time and place that a lot of us don't know anything about. So if you want to learn about Japanese culture and history, you should definitely sit down and watch some Japanese cinema. And if you need a suggestion, just ask.